This is a
Hello and
classic
welcome to
karaoke
this week's
highlighted
episode
caption.
of Leadership Before Titles. I am Roger Tercios and we have Jackie and Lawrence that be sharing their snippets as well. In past episodes, we've broken down some high profile leadership failures, case studies that, while important, can sometimes feel a little too far removed from our own experiences. It's easy to read about a fraud through the news, on social media, and it's easy to assume that, oh, this will never happen at my job. But unethical leadership doesn't always look like a headline, and it doesn't always look the same. Sometimes it shows up quietly in the way that someone treats you, in approval processes, or even through assignments that just don't seem ethical. That's why in this episode, we decided to focus on our own stories, real experiences that made us question leadership, power, and ethics in the work. So, first, I'll start off by sharing my experience in my first full time corporate role. I was 19 years old, working at an oil and gas company, and of course, the youngest salaried employee there. At first, I was proud of that, really excited about it, but it didn't take long for me to realize I was being treated differently, and not in a good way. Whenever I needed to complete even the most basic tasks, that were already part of my job. I had to go through more layers of approval than anyone else. The person at the center of all of this was the regional vice president. She had complete oversight of our team, and while she was never outwardly hostile, her leadership was quietly damaging. For instance, at company events, she would instruct coworkers to keep an eye on me. I wasn't being supported, I was mostly being monitored. It created an atmosphere of suspicion, as if I could be trusted to represent the company without surveillance. And as researchers explained in a 2023 BMC psychology study, leaders fail to build high quality relationships with employees. It leads to disengagement, higher stress, and fewer opportunities for growth. And that's exactly what I experienced. I wasn't being coached, I wasn't being mentored, encouraged, or even empowered. I was isolated, overmanaged, and treated like a liability. And then came the moment that to this day still feels so unreal. At the time, there was a nationwide pause on LNG projects, which was a significant political and regulatory moment. One day, the regional VP pulled me aside privately and told me to draft a 10-page letter of support to then President Joe Biden, advocating for LNG expansion. She didn't loop in my direct manager like she usually would. Didn't involve the government affairs team, who are literally responsible for policy communication, and didn't provide me with any resources or background. Instead, she provided me with a 1 hour deadline. This was this was not a challenge. It was really just a setup for failure. Um, to back this up, a 2021 study in Frontiers in Psychology explored how transformational leadership, when paired with ethical leadership, leads to stronger employee performance, lower burnout, and reduce counterproductive behavior. But what I experienced was the total opposite. There was no vision, no support, no teamwork, just an impossible demand dropped on someone young and new with zero resources. That is certainly not leadership. And that's really damage is distinguished as delegation. Another incident that stands out was when she asked me to drive 2 hours to a regional office just to pick up some printed papers, despite the fact that there were several other team members that were already physically at that office. So it didn't make any sense. It wasn't about efficiency. At that point, it was about control. It was about treating me as the most expendable person in the room, and of course, that directly contradicts ethical leadership as defined by Brown and Torino, two of the most cited scholars on the topic, who emphasize that ethical leaders act with fairness, transparency, and respect for all employees, regardless of age, experience, or status. None of that was present in the way I was. And to close it all, when I finally decided to submit my 2 weeks notice, she completely refused to meet with me. No conversation, no acknowledgement, not even a good. So I showed up every day for those final 2 weeks, finished my work, left knowing that the same person who had once micromanaged me, my every move, didn't think I was worth a goodbye. And so that's my story. But now I'll pass it on to Jackie, who will share her experience and continue the conversation about how leadership isn't just about titles, but it's also about the way people treat you every single.
Hi, I'm really excited to share with you this case study of bad ethical leadership that I've actually experienced. But before, I just want to say this. A recent study by Wang et al. In 2025 showed that psychological empowerment and positive work schemas don't create negative work environments, but they create positive work environments. People who are being led ethically and morally at the organizations are more prone to have job satisfaction and stay at their jobs. And they've also, in that study, they showed that financial incentives won't keep people at jobs all the time. Just because somebody needs money, just because they have this job, because they need to support themselves, their families, a lot of people are going to stay and endure unethical leadership. So at this academy, they asked me to sign off on assessments and not interview kids and say that I did. And I told them I wouldn't do that because my training said that I had to do these things in order to get accurate information, in order to accurately track their progress that we shared with educators, therapists, judges, probation officers to indicate that they're ready to go back into the community. But they wanted me to do other things throughout the day and not spend my time interviewing kids. They said, those kids won't even want to sit down and talk to you anyway. So they they didn't act with integrity. They didn't care about my credibility, my morals. They could have used a transformative touch in their leadership. There was high attrition, very high attrition rates, and high turnover. And I remember reading a review before applying or when I applied for the job saying to stay away from this position because of the leadership. There was a lot of family there. And that was the system they had in place. This was the culture there. And um, it really pushed people away and kept the quality uh, not up to par to what it should be for a department of juvenile justice such as that. So, um, Nordhaus explains that transformative leaders produce empowered workers. Empowered workers are not satisfied with the status quo. I was not satisfied with the level of quality there, the lack of quality there. Um, and they are not satisfied with suppression of the needs of others. So the transformative approach there would have asked workers, what do you need? What training do you need? What do we need to do as leadership to ensure that we have people to do all of these other jobs so that you can focus on what you are hired to do? Um, it was very transactional with them. They just wanted to get things done, regardless of whether the kids were getting helped or not, and at the expense of the workers there. So um, I wouldn't have felt that I added any value to the youth, the treatment of the youth or their outcomes if I performed the tasks the way they wanted me to. Addressing the youth's needs appropriately and addressing them in proper ways is the reason I became a case manager in the first place back then. The bad leadership is the reason many of those employees and frankly the youth will not achieve optimal functionality, efficiency, or satisfaction at their time at the academy. And that's very sad. Thank you for listening to my case study.
Thank you, Jackie. That's wild how leadership can affect a company. It can affect its bottom line, and it really shows that when leaders are unethical, they do not really possess the ability to grow the company in the right way, and they do not possess the ability to build those who are under them in the right way either. But there's an article in Forbes called "A Look Back at Why Blockbuster Really Failed and Why It Didn't Have to." And it talks specifically to Jackie's example about working for people who are unethical. And the story goes that Reed Hastings, he's the founder of Netflix. He flew to Dallas and he proposed a partnership with John Antioco, who ran Blockbuster. In his own right, was a very good executive. Many considered him a retail genius. But we know what happened. Blockbuster went out of of business. They went bankrupt in 2010, and Netflix is still around, and they're a $28 billion company, 10 times what Blockbuster was worth. So scientists calls it a social epidemic. It happened when Antioco failed to see that networks of unseen connections really determined whether he was successful or not. But one thing that they had a problem with was they made it the most of the bulk of their money charging late fees to customers. That was the company's Achilles heel. They made a profit off of penalizing its patrons. You purposely set a trap for them so that you penalize them and constantly get money. And they were making to the tune of $200 million a year off these penalties. That's how they made their money. That was the bulk of their money. John Antioco decided, hey, let's do away with this fee. Let's do away with it and let's switch to online. And they didn't like him. According to the Harvard Business Review, one of his guys that was on the board, Jim Keyes, he was like, no. And then Carl Icahn also did the same thing. And then they fired him because they didn't want to give him compensation. So you see how a company that was greedy over money fired the guy who was going to lead them into more profitability over money. And then they went bankrupt 5 years later. So we see what happens when unethical leaders from the top incorporate that unethical practice into their company.
And with that, we close out our series of stories that, while they are different in detail, share one powerful thought line. Leadership can shape more than just productivity. It really shapes people's self-worth, psychological safety, and future decisions. What each of us shared today wasn't just about frustration or mismanagement. It was about how unethical or unsupportive leadership leaves lasting impacts that ripple far beyond the workplace. Whether it was inclusion, micromanagement, unrealistic expectations, or bias, there these aren't more than just flaws in leadership style. They're breaches in ethical responsibility. If leadership is truly about influence and integrity, then today's episode reminds us that title doesn't guarantee either. Each story we heard was a real world counter argument to what scholars define as effective, ethical, and transformational leadership. So here's our final questions for you to reflect on. If most professionals have experienced bad leadership at some point in their careers, what does that have to say about how we select, train, and hold leaders accountable today? And more importantly, what systematic changes are we willing to make to stop normalizing leadership that causes harm? Thank you for joining us on Leadership Before Titles. Until next time.